Have you played any cool games this week?
Yeah, I've been playing a lot of Boros Moxite actually with the new Ragged Short Spear.
Yeah.
So that's a deck that I always like the Glinthawk and Skyfisher decks.
Hmm.
But Boros Synth never really spoke to me that much. I've played it a lot, and honestly, I think the big problem with it is that it, other than Glinthawk and Skyfisher, the backup creatures are Thraben Inspectors, and that's just not a good clock. So like you have the burn win, which is cool. You got a couple good flyers, but then you just have all these guys that are like the games grind so much because you just don't have good finishers.
Yeah.
So that's why I've always preferred the black versions, Orzhov and Esper with refurb. You have more flyers. Obviously, with Esper, you have Mirror Enforcers, Neutral Monitors, etc.
Yeah. It sounds like it's like it almost acts as like a mini gate package almost, where it's like still
Yeah.
doing the thing. It's kind of in the background, doesn't slow your deck down too much, but then can increase your clock when you need it to increase and like kind of turn that corner.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I was wondering about like whether or not it'll see play and things like Tribe. um, Stuff
Mm.
like that, where it can like put on an additional clock, like hit on a different avenue, or even like in mono red madness, if it's going to kind of turn things around, where it's like, hey, throw this on a snacker, and it's like there's an additional like doubling of your clock.
Yeah, there were people who at Powergeddon who were playing Moxite instead of like some highway robberies,
Hmm.
which is pretty interesting. And so before that, I would have thought like, well, you just want the instants and sorceries. It's just worse. But people like the Moxite a lot. It did really well, so I could definitely see the short spear being good there too. Obviously, the Moxite's a little bit better like in a vacuum because you don't need another creature. But being able to make your sneaky snacker a 4/1 that keeps coming back is really strong if you have the extra mana for it.
Yeah. Have you run into any cool decks?
I've been running into so much Tron. Tron is like on the upswing. I mean, it's inevitable with Prophetic Prism getting unbanned, Bonder's Ornament. Now we have Giant's Boulder,
Yeah.
so we're getting these like Tronza lists that are
Uh-huh.
like trying to blow up your mana because they just play 3 boulders and then start paying 7 to blow up your lands on turn 3.
Yeah.
Um, so I've heard just regular Ponza is at like an all-time high because it's preying on the Tron decks, but I'm
Hmm.
not much of a Ponza player. But I have been stocking Cleansing Wildfires in my sideboard to beat Tron.
Yeah, I was playing so we had our weekly popper night at 5-6 last night, and I was playing against a round two. I played against a zoo deck.
Mm.
And I had not play I don't think I've ever actually played against zoo. I've known that it existed. Um but I'm wondering if that deck is just like a couple of cards from really having legs, and kind of making an impact in the meta, or if it's just worth revisiting right now.
Yeah, was it like Wild Nicodle and stuff like that, or
Yeah.
what else did it have for like win cons?
So it ran a bunch of creatures. It ran Bushwhacker to kind of turn the
Mm.
corner. So running Burning Tree Emissaries, kind of running the multicolor package too. So the creatures from the Alara block, where they get a benefit if you control another multicolored creature. So like Hushblade and the one that gives haste,
Yep.
which was kind of neat. Um, the interesting one was, is it something outburst? It's the Cascade spell,
Violent Outbursts.
Violent Outburst. So Violent Outburst also ran as kind of a with a bunch of hasty creatures and pumping your creatures. It was really interesting. It was scary at times. I was playing mono white, which is probably one of its less good matchups, and it came close to running me over a few times. So I took game one barely, and no, sorry, I lost game one barely. Then I won game two by kind of turning the tides, and then game three ended up going to time since we grinded it out. I think I would have gotten there eventually, but it's kind of the limitation of being the try to slow down a deck.
Yeah, that's crazy. I played a zoo domain deck on the channel a couple weeks ago that from a deck donation, and it had Wild Nicodle, but then it had like your what is it, Tribal Flames to deal 5 with like domain package, Farseeks, and things like that to get it. Um, and the deck it was a little rough, but it was a cool concept, and I like the sound of the one you're describing here. Violent Outburst, I think, is a little bit of an underrated card.
Yeah, no, it was really cool. I mean, it's one of those two cards for one, and if all of your creatures are hits, then like great, like you're gonna hit, especially if it hits a hasty. And then the round. So yesterday I did awful. My record was 0-2-1.
Oof.
which is like one of the worst I've ever done. Um, but it was one of those nights that every game was like really close and played really well. And I played against some really good players. So like round one, I was playing mono white against a like glint blade, and I was against a player at our store that is just like so skilled. Every time I play against him, I'm very impressed with his play patterns. And he ended up beating me, but every game was really close. Every game was kind of grindy. It was just like those creature versus creature matchups that just like play so fun, where every decision point like determines the game.
Mm.
And so it was wonderful. And then round two, it was the zoo deck, which was the same boat. And then round three, I ended up playing against familiars, which was just
Yeah, that's a tough
it was
one.
rough. But like the player was really good, and it was just yeah, it was fun to play.
Thanks to Card Market for sponsoring this video.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and welcome everyone to the Familiar Podcast. This is episode 4, and on this episode, we'll be discussing the Mulligan and when not to mulligan for a deck. So first, I just wanted to break down a quick rundown of how the mulligan has kind of changed over time. And the reason for that is I know for myself, the mulligan has not always been the same. It's changed. I don't know, Jason, has it always been the same for you?
No, I've been playing since we had the what was it, the Vancouver Mulligan.
Mm.
And I think I started like right after, and I didn't do a lot of competitive play early on in my when I started Magic, but I think I started shortly after like the Paris rule, or partial Paris was
Hmm.
was the official rule. So Vancouver and the current London Mulligan I've been
Yeah.
a part of.
Do you know what the original rule was?
I don't think I know what the original rule was.
Yes. So
Oh, was it? Wait. Let me take a guess. Was it
take a stab.
if you had all lands or no lands, you could mulligan, and otherwise you had to keep your hand, something like that?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So, so if you revealed your hand and it was only lands or no lands, then you can mulligan for free. You get one free. Otherwise, you're stuck with that hand. So one landers you're stuck with.
Brutal.
6 landers you're stuck with. It was very brutal. This is actually how they do it in Pokemon, I think. Still, Pokemon, it's if you have a basic Pokemon, you can reveal your hand and do a mulligan. If people want to correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, feel free. But yeah, it can lead to some brutal hands. So not a very friendly mulligan pattern. Then in 1997, they switched to the Paris Mulligan, which is the rule that you can return your hand and draw one less card this time around. So this is the mulligan rule I started with in Magic, and also less brutal, but still pretty brutal. Um, like you mulligan very sparingly, because when you mulligan, you really risk just not having another playable hand, because again, you're seeing one less card. So a lot of the times, if you pulled a no lander the first time or a one lander the first time, drawing only 6 cards, there's still a pretty good chance that you're going to have a one lander or a no lander. And then mulliganing down to 5, it's basically just like a scoop. So yeah, when you're sitting across from your opponent, and you might recall this, and they mull down to 5, it was just basically game end.
Yeah, you get to try again, but you have fewer chances to draw the correct cards. So it's just like diminishing returns.
Yes.
I can imagine mulliganing once is like, well, you probably just got to keep just about any hand on 6 in that
Right.
mulligan.
And it really hurt like combo decks, like things that really needed their lands. Like I think probably aggro decks played a little bit better because of that, where they could like function on one land and kind of turn the corner, whereas like combo-y decks, maybe like control decks, struggled a bit more for that reason, because they really need the cards that they need to see. Maybe like cantrippy decks still did well too, because you can like draw into the cards that you need, but and probably have to mulligan a lot less as well. Then we moved to when Wizards went back to the drawing board in 2015, and we looked at the Vancouver mulligan. I remember this change. This was like a really, like, people were worried, like, oh man, this is going to break the game. This was one of those moments where people are like, Magic's going to die here.
Of course.
because they're changing this mulligan rule, and all of a sudden combo decks are going to be unbeatable. And this was, like, in hindsight, a really minor change.
Yeah, I mean the Vancouver mulligan is where you still mulligan down, you only get 6 or 5 cards or whatever, but then you get to scry one,
Yeah.
right? If you've mulliganed, so you get a little bit of insight into what your next card is going to be, but also you get to just decide if you want that card or not. I believe that was only after you kept your 5 or your 6 cards you got the scry,
Hmm.
so it couldn't help inform your keep, but it was still definitely a little bit of extra bonus there.
Yep, it was just like a little upgrade. So you can kind of see the pattern of wizards. Like, okay, mulligans are brutal. Let's make them a little less brutal. It's still kind of brutal. Let's make them a little less brutal. So where we have the Scry one, and then finally in 2019 we have the London Mulligan, where all of a sudden now you still always draw a 7-card hand, and you just put back the cards on the bottom of your deck, one for each time you have to mulligan, which is where we're kind of sitting at today, and a lot less brutal.
Yeah, I mean, you get to see the same number of cards every single time. So if your 7-card hand sucks, ship it away, see another 7-card hand, and then you just get rid of whatever's worse there. So there's still a cost. There really needs to be a cost for mulliganing. Otherwise, you're going to mulligan indefinitely until you find the literal perfect hand. But yeah, it's not quite as brutal. People still get to play Magic even if they mulligan once or twice, which is nice.
Yeah, and it really changed how we see the mulligan too, right? So I would say with these steps, especially looking back at the original mulligan and especially the Paris mulligan, you really didn't have the luxury of mulliganing like iffy hands. You really could only mulligan like unusable hands. As the mulligan has gotten more graceful, gives more grace with your mulligan. Now all of a sudden it becomes a tool in your play where you're not just evaluating whether or not this hand is possible to work or can do anything, but you're able to look at the intricacies of your hand and be like, is this really the best in this matchup? Does my deck mulligan well? You can design decks that mulligan well so that you can mulligan more, take advantage of the mulligan, to the point that you have cards like Tron that can totally win on a 4-card hand if they have natural Tron and they can turn things around. There's kind of a lot of grace that's been given in these mulligan rules that has made mulligans a way more difficult thing to decipher in your play patterns.
Was the partial Paris rule ever officially implemented? I don't have the history like pulled up like you do, but partial Paris, if I recall, is like you got to choose. You didn't have to ship your entire hand to draw a new one, but you could ship. I don't know if it was specifically 3 cards or if it was like you get to choose 4 cards from your hand. So you draw your 7, you decide, oh, I'm going to put 4 back, shuffle those in, and then you draw that many cards back.
If I recall, that was happening at the same time as the Paris Mulligan rule, and it was a kind of a debate between those two. But I don't think it was ever a competitive rule. Now, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. Again, maybe I'm wrong, but I believe that's my understanding of it. But I don't have it right here.
Fair enough.
All right. So there's a lot of complexity in mulligans. I would say probably one of the most difficult things in learning to play Magic is when to mulligan. Whenever I'm teaching somebody, usually it's starting with Commander, but whenever I'm teaching anyone in any format, it's always, do you have 3 or 4 lands? Do you have the colors that you need? Then it's a good keep. If you have 1 or 2, probably not.
Yeah, I mean, in drafting was something that I did pretty competitively for about 5 years. And we have the phrase lands and spells.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, every form of Magic has that, but drafting is really where I think it originates and like is true, where it's like if you have lands and spells, you probably keep that hand because limited, you can't get really picky. And I think Pauper is honestly the closest to that as far as a constructed format of like,
Mm-hmm.
there are definitely hands that have lands and spells that you want to mulligan. But often it's like, well, if you can cast the things in your hand, you probably just want to keep it. And so, yeah, that's definitely the simplest instructions for someone learning how to mulligan is just like, does your hand play lands and then can it actually interact with the board or do something at least?
Yeah. And I think that's an important note too. Nothing playable. Like if you have a hand that there's nothing that you can play in your hand, it's kind of the same as a hand with all lands and no action. So like if you had a 3 lands and those 3 lands can't cast your 4, 5, or 6 drop, then it's probably a mulligan. if you're not playing anything for the first 3 or 4 turns, probably a mulligan.
And like you said, having your colors, you could even have your blue and your red, but if you're a Grixis deck and you don't have any black, and you have 3 black spells in hand, you can't cast any of them, that's going to be a mulligan as well. Like, you have to be able to,
Right.
You can definitely keep hands that don't have all 3 of your colors if you're playing a 3-color deck, but not if the spells in your hand are all of that color, you know?
Right. And like we were talking about the early mulligan rules, that's kind of where these all stem from, right? Like even the first mulligan rule, like that was the limit. You had to have no lands or all lands. But even when I was starting out, like it was always just like that was what you decide. You go or you don't go based on that. But I would even take sometimes I would even take a hand that I don't have or that's like 3 and 4 drops, or like 4 and 5 drops, because like the hope of drawing into them was better than mulliganing. But that's no longer the case. That's kind of where we all start out, right? Is whether or not it's a usable hand, and then the mulligan decision is easy. It's just like a matter of adding 1, 2, and 3, and you're good to go. And the next level, though, that gets a little tougher, that I would say, is being able to question whether or not you know what your deck does, and does this hand meet that strategy. So I was talking last night when I was at a Pauper night with my opponent in round 3, named Beatrice, who's a really talented Familiars player. And they were saying that the decision that they make whenever they're deciding to mulligan with Familiars is almost entirely based on just knowing what their deck does and if the hand does what their deck does. So Familiars really plays like a combo deck, but also just a kind of control deck trying to survive until it can complete its combo. So if the hand represents like a line to it doing its combo-y thing, or getting a familiar out so that it can reduce its spells and do all of its drawing, then that's one of kind of the deciding factors when they're deciding to keep or draw, which is just really important in knowing what your deck does.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of decks that you could look at a hand of lands and spells and be like, oh, it might be okay here, or I might keep it. But it's important to know not just like what the end goal of your deck is, but how you get there.
Mm-hmm.
I think a good example is like Red Rally. Your goal is, as an aggro deck, you're trying to kill your opponent, right? You kill them as quickly as possible. But if you have a hand that's 2 mountains and 5 burn spells, that's not really a keepable hand, because there's a reason you're not playing burn, right? There's a reason that just a traditional burn deck of all lightning bolts doesn't really function in Pauper, because there's too much life gain, counter spells, whatever it is that's going to get in the way of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's why Red Rally isn't built that way. Red Rally is built to reduce your opponent's life total, but specifically use creatures to deal the majority of the damage and then finish them off with a couple of burn spells. So if you keep that hand of 3 lightning bolts, 2 galvanic blasts, 2 mountains, yeah, you have like 16 damage in hand, or somewhere around there, depending on if you have Metalcraft. But like, are you really going to be able to kill your opponent before they just gain a little bit of life, have up counter spells, kill you first potentially? The whole point of your creatures is that they can deal 1 or 2 or 3 damage every single turn. So if you have a Burning Tree Emissary that keeps getting pumped by your Bushwhacker, that's a lightning bolt every single turn that you're able to deal. And so it's important to not just be like, well, my end goal is deal a bunch of damage and I have a bunch of damage in the hand, but specifically my avenue to get to there is a bunch of creatures, and this hand does not have that.
Yeah. Pauper is such a synergy driven format because the power level of individual cards are relatively weak compared to other formats, but they really shine in the kind of streamlined approach and the narrow approach that decks kind of build, where I would say that most decks in Pauper without synergy just start becoming like draft chaff. Right. So it's like yeah, like fairies without its synergy and without its like payoffs and without its draws, it's like there's some matchups and hands that you can keep with a fairies deck where it's just like, okay, I'm just gonna play a 1 mana 1/1 3 turns in a row, and that's all my deck's gonna do, without it doing its thing. I'm not saying that's all the decks in the format. Some have a little more space, but like Familiars, same thing. Like if they're just playing 0-3 walls or creatures that aren't doing the thing and aren't following the synergy of the deck or aren't leading to kind of the end game of the deck, it just flounders and it just looks like you're playing a draft deck.
Yeah, I mean, Seagate Oracle is notoriously the worst card in Familiars, and if you're paying 3 mana for that card, it is really bad. But when you get it for 2 mana, it's pretty decent, and 1 mana, it's incredible. I say this a lot about Black Sack, that it's the best deck that plays all terrible cards, because the cards individually are really bad. You play a 1/1 that dies into a 1/1. How does that kill your opponent? Well, it doesn't usually do that, but the synergy with all the other cards is really, really good. But there's a reason that like 90% of the cards played in that deck aren't played in any other deck. It's because they're only good when they're all combined. And so you're not going to see a lot of those cards in other decks. But it is definitely a spectrum. Like if you get to Jund Wildfire, I think is the biggest deck that people say, well, it's just all good cards that you throw together. And that is mostly true. It's a lot of really good cards. There's obviously still synergy. Refurbished Familiar needs artifacts, so you have a bunch of artifacts. The whole basis of the deck is Cleansing Wildfire plus Bridge, which is a cool synergy. Of course, you have a bunch of Ichor Wellsprings and ways to sacrifice them, right? So there are little synergies, but they also kind of just lead up to like, well, we play Chrysalis, we play Refurb, we play all the best cards, and then we win that way. So there's a spectrum of it for sure, but yeah, a lot of decks are based on just the synergies. Even Red Rally, like I was saying, is a burn aggro deck that's very fast, very good. It's our, quintessential red deck wins, but it's built around Burning Tree Emissary plus Rally at the Hornburg, which is a synergy in itself that's really strong. People aren't playing Rally because it makes 2 1/1s with haste. They're playing it because it makes 2 1/1s with haste and gives Burning Tree Emissary, which was essentially free, haste, and then that's really, really strong.
Yeah, and it's kind of like what we were talking about when we talked about deck building a few episodes ago or a few weeks ago. Is usually when you're deck building and you're like really trying to brew from scratch, you don't usually just start with a card. Usually you start with a synergy. So you start with how 2 cards interact or multiple cards interact, and you're like, okay, how can we build this out? Where are other cards that kind of fit into this? Does this already fit into a shell where it just improves the shell? How do we kind of align that? And I think that's just the nature of Pauper as a format for the most part, is it's just these ingrained synergies, and maybe this is just Magic in general, but those ingrained synergies that really determine whether a deck can play, and you can really find those strategies and those synergies by mulliganing strategically, versus just taking hands that are playable but might not do anything. What I found that really improved my game when I'm mulliganing is when I'm making that decision, I'm asking myself, looking at especially my first mulligan, I'm looking at my 7-card hand, and I'm picturing out what my next like 2, 3, 4 turns are going to look like. 1, 2, 3, 4 turns are going to look like, so that I can know if my deck is going to do the thing that it's going to do. So like you were saying with Rally Red, if you have a hand with a few lands and a bunch of burn spells, and you're sitting there with your hand and you're asking, okay, what is my turn 1 going to look like? Am I just going to throw a burn spell at their face? And then am I going to throw 2 burn spells at their face and then have nothing to do? Like you kind of start to work that out to know like, okay, how are my turns going to progress? Or like, if I keep this hand, do I need to draw something on turn 2 or turn 3, or am I going to like die? If I draw 2, 3 lands in a row, am I just going to lose? So those are kind of the decision points and those questions that you ask, but picturing and planning multiple turns ahead, I think, is a really big step in improving your game in Magic and Pauper in general.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that there's a lot of emphasis on that, like, what am I going to draw? I've generally heard from a lot of like more pro players that like it's okay to keep a hand that is like a little bit iffy, you're on the edge, but you need to draw one thing as long as that thing is pretty prevalent in your deck, right? You can't say, well, I need to draw this one specific card. You're probably not going to draw that one specific card, right? But if it's, well, I need one more land, and you're playing 20 lands, maybe you have a couple in hand, so you have 18. It's like, well, the chances of you drawing one out of your 18 lands is pretty high, at least in the first 3 turns, right? And so I think that's an okay hand to keep. But if you need 2 things, then it's like, well, what are the chances you draw your land plus a 3-drop? Like, It's a lot harder. And so if you need just one more generic card, I think those are generally keepable hands, as long as your hand does operate a little bit, right? Maybe it's a hand that's your Boros, and you don't have your red mana, but you still have like 3 playable white spells, and you have a couple red spells. So it's like, well, I can do some things for a couple of turns, But then if I don't find my red source by turn 4, I'm going to be in some trouble. That's generally a fine hand to keep. Obviously, if the hand doesn't do anything without that card, it's a lot more difficult to really bank on drawing that card exactly at the time when you need it.
Yeah, and that's also kind of going in blind too, right? Which brings us to the next point. So we talked about the easy mulligan. I would say determining like that first level of mulliganing, you just need to know Magic, right? Like you need to know the basics of Magic, and you can figure that out. Just follow the rule. Level 2, you need to know thy deck, right? Know what your deck does, know what its plan is, know what when it does something, when it doesn't do something, know its synergies. So that's kind of the second level. Then the third level is not only knowing your deck, but your opponent's deck and how those decks interact, which I think is the hardest level of these three, because one, you need to know the meta, you need to know what you're going up against. Sometimes you're going to be going up against a brew and you're not going to know what you're going up against, so you have to make decisions based on kind of what colors are, and on your first hand you really are just in the dark a lot of the times. So I think that the this next level is the most challenging to achieve, and it really can only be reached if you already reached the second level, the first level, the second level, and then once you hit the third level, that's where you can start digging into how your deck interacts with your opponent's deck.
Yeah, I think that there are definitely hands that would be totally uncapable against certain opponents that are great against others. If you are playing something like John's Wildfire, which is a mid-range / control deck, and then you're against another control deck, maybe you're against Golgari Gardens, which is a notoriously very long, grindy matchup.
Mm-hmm.
In that situation, it might be okay to keep a 6 land hand, because you know you're going to be in for the long game. You're going to want to hit your lands anyway, and that gives you a leg up. Like the moment one control opponent, or one of you two, if you're both control, stops playing lands, that person usually starts falling behind.
Mm-hmm.
So it's okay to keep a hand like that in a certain situation. But if you're against Red Rally, what are you doing? You're playing lands for 6 turns and then you're going to die, right? Because you have no interaction, you have no life gain, you have nothing else. And so that's a hand that sounds like in a vacuum it might be a mulligan, but in the right matchup it could definitely be a keep, even a snap keep. Like I would instantly keep that hand against a control opponent, but there's no way that you can keep it against an aggro deck or even a lot of mid-range decks.
Yeah. An example is last night I was playing against a opponent running Esper Glintblade, and I was playing mono white weenies. And game 3, I think they probably my opponent's name was James, very very good player. I think James kept a hand of maybe like 4 or 5 lands, and if for those of you that don't know, in that matchup, that is probably a wise thing to do, because because mono white is running Dust to Dust, which can clear out lands, really restrict your opponent's deck. And my opponent had already seen in game 2 that I already hit them with a Dust to Dust, and so I ended up losing that game, largely because I Dust to Dust twice, cleared out a bunch of their lands, but it wasn't enough to slow them down enough to get the win. And because they were understanding of kind of the restrictions of the deck and what they were going up against, they knew my deck like the back of their hand. James is a great just mid-range player in general, so very familiar with mono white weenies. So he was able to make that decision point and know that, like, hey, this deck has a little bit of action, but it has a lot of lands. I'm going to be able to play out my lands, hit my land drops every turn. So even if my lands start getting cleared out, I can still turn this game around and still win. So really wise decision. Didn't need a mulligan. Most players probably would have been like, ooh, mono white weenies, I need to be aggressive. I can't take a slower hand that has 5 lands in it. I need to mulligan this hand. But he knew he could have kept that hand and was able to turn around and win the game.
Certainly against any sort of deck that's going to be blowing up your lands. Obviously if you're affinity against a white or even a red opponent, also if you're just like against Panza or something like that, it's generally a good idea to keep a hand that has 1 or 2 more lands, because if you keep a 2-lander and lose even one of them, you're probably not going to be able to come back from that. So yeah, there's always a balance of like, what does my deck want to do, but also what does my opponent's deck want to do, and how how can I keep a hand that does both ideally? But like if your opponent is going to be the aggressor in any way, whether that's attacking or like blowing up your lands or anything proactive like that, you want to keep a hand that is more able to survive through that than like perform your own game plan, right? Like if you're a Jund deck against Rally again, your primary game plan should be survival. How do I not die to them? So like hands with breath weapons or Kirkland shamans or Weather the Storm is going to be much more preferable than to like, oh well, I have a couple Chrysalis and I'll be able to kill them with these. It's like, well, if you don't survive the early game, you're never going to be able to do that. And so you can sometimes get rid of a perfectly serviceable hand in order to find one that actually like works for the matchup, which is, as you mentioned earlier, mulliganing is one of the hardest parts about Magic. But the hardest thing for me ever is like, this hand looks great in a vacuum, but it's just not what I need in this matchup. I need to get rid of it. And that's a very difficult decision. But like, is the hand really going to do what you need if you keep it? And if you're thinking about it, it's probably a no most of the time.
And also understanding the matchup and like knowing, like what you were going on. Can you afford to go down to 6? Or can you afford to not go down to 6 with that hand? An example that I've run into too is like elves v elves. If you are keeping a hand that would normally be a great hand, has creatures, has lands, does your strategy, but doesn't have Priest of Titania or another big elf payoff that works with the board overall, because how the old elves were templated is they give the benefit based on the number of elves on the board. So in the mirror match, all of their elves count towards your elves, similar with like slivers. So if you are taking a hand that's playable but doesn't have those cards in it, then you are just going to lose. It's like you mulligan down to the cards that you need. You mulligan down to like the sideboard cards that you need, or else you're going to lose. Which kind of brings up to the point that like knowing your win percentage against a deck, how aggressive you need to be with your mulligan, how important that your hand needs to play perfect can be really beneficial. So if you're in a matchup that you're like a 30-70, then you need to mulligan to a hand that isn't just average, but is well above average. If you are playing a deck that you're 70% favored over your opponent that's only 30% favored, vice versa, right? Like you could probably keep a hand that's decent, that's going to get there, because you have the ability to lean on your deck's natural power level against your opponent's deck a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. I also think that there's a lot to be said, like you mentioned, about mulliganing down to a specific like card. Like if you have those matchups that are super polarized, 30% to 70%, generally that means your sideboard is going to be stocked with cards to fix that matchup. Maybe some people take it the opposite way, where they just like accept that's a loss and they're not going to care about it at all. That's certainly not how I play. I want to have game against every single matchup possible, so if I can. So, if you have that 30-70 matchup, you bring in maybe 8 cards. Maybe it's like a blue versus red matchup or something like that, or vice versa, red versus blue. So you have those 8 Pyroblasts or Hydroblasts to bring in. And then if you open a hand that just looks like as if you didn't sideboard, just 7 standard cards that are in your main deck, it's like, well, maybe it's an okay hand, maybe it's reasonable enough to keep, but you know that you just brought in a bunch of very powerful silver bullet cards and you don't have any of them. So is that hand really something you want to keep, knowing that your opponent also probably brought in a bunch of silver bullets against you and has access to them, and so now they have counter spells for 1 mana instead of 2 mana? How are you really going to keep up with them if they're like winning so heavily in that advantage?
Yeah. And like we were talking about last week, is finding a deck. When we talked about finding a deck, and this is where kind of sticking with a deck for a while could be really valuable. So knowing those matchups, understanding your deck and how it does its strategy, but then how it pairs up against certain matchups, because there's often times that I'll go into a matchup and be like, I have no idea how to mulligan against this matchup. I have no idea how important my sideboard cards are against this matchup. But you learn from those experiences and you grow from those experiences, and it's something you get to take with you to the next game. That's often, I think this is probably one of the reasons why one of the general recommendations when going to a larger tournament is to not prioritize the meta and picking a deck that's best for the meta, but instead prioritize picking the deck that you are most familiar with, because you're going to have these decisions, and the less time and the less thought that you have to put into these decisions, and the less you can pull from familiar experiences, the less thought you're putting into those games, and the more successful you're going to be in general.
Yeah. I mean, familiarity is a huge thing. And like a great example is whenever I play White Weenie and I go up against elves, That's a very difficult matchup because we both put a ton of creatures on the board, but generally Elves is a lot faster, right? Because what we need is more of a mid-range slow deck, and Elves just has the ability to spiral out of control. This is a matchup that I've found that you pretty much have to have sideboard cards to be able to win, unless if your opponent just kind of stumbles. And so usually when I'm playing White Weenie, I bring in Standard Bearer, which makes it so that all of their stuff has to target your creatures, which is really good. And then also Holy Light, which is a bad board wipe, -1/-1 for 3 mana, but it works really well in that matchup. And so I've literally gone in multiple videos, like gone down to 4 to find these specific cards, and then they just win me the game. And it's like I'm getting rid of perfectly serviceable, 6 and 7 card hands that I would keep in the blind. I would keep in a lot of other matches. And it's just like, well, it's just a bunch of Thraben Inspectors, Core Skyfishers. That doesn't do anything against Elves. I need to find my interaction. And then if I land a Standard Bearer on turn 2, often that can just win the game. If they can't kill it with like a Monstrous Emergence, like suddenly their Quirion Rangers don't give them more mana. Their Timberwatch Elves have to pump my creature. Their Nyxborn Hydras can't bestow their own creatures. And like those are 3 of the most powerful things that deck does in general. And then if you can Holy Light to give everything -1/-1, you can kill the Priest of Titania, etc. So it's very important. I would say this is probably a matchup that like without the sideboard cards is like probably 30, maybe 40% to win. And I've learned that you gotta look for those sideboard cards and basically throw everything else to the wind.
Yeah, and actually vice versa for Elves in that matchup. It's really important that Elves hits their removal in their sideboard cards, because knowing that you're playing against mono white, you need to know that you need to bring in your few removal spells. Otherwise, a Standard Bearer just knocks out like half your deck.
Yep.
and Elves not running removal in the first place can really hurt it. So knowing that and knowing what you might run into, it's really important that Elves mulligans very carefully.
One other thing that I think is really important when you're mulliganing, if you go low, I would say to 5 cards or fewer, is that it starts being really important that you keep cards in your hand that have the potential to be more valuable than they are. So like if you keep a 7-card hand and everything's a 1-for-1, that's totally fine. But if you go down to 4 or 5 cards, suddenly your cards need to be pulling more weight. Like if you have a 4-card hand versus an opponent who has 7 cards, they're going to outvalue you if your cards are only doing a little bit of value. And so often I will keep cards intentionally when I go low that have the potential to hit way above their pay grade. So for example, in Esper Affinity, which is something that I play quite a bit, I've won probably 3 or 4 games off of a mulligan to 4, specifically with 2 lands that produce all of my 3 colors of mana, a Cryogen Relic, and then a Glint Hawk or a Core Skyfisher. Because that combination is obviously what the deck's built around, right? Cryogen plus a Core Skyfisher and a Glint Hawk can draw you 3 additional cards that can kind of unmulligan you a lot of times. And then you can kind of get back into the game. Whereas maybe you would be more prone to keeping, I don't know, some cast downs or removal or something like that, because you're trying to survive when you have so few resources. But like a 1-for-1 cast down is not going to win you the game when you have so few resources. You need to be able to get the cards that have the potential to high roll a little bit in that example. I'm sure with like Elves, if you mulligan to 4 or even 3 or something like that, you're probably always going to try to keep like a Winding Way or a Lead the Stampede, because that could draw you 4 or 5 cards. And suddenly your mulligan is like not even that impactful. Even if, well, I would bet like if you go to 3 cards and you might keep Forest Winding Way over like a Forest Priest of Titania or something, just because like drawing 4 is so much more important than having like a creature that doesn't even produce that much mana when it's sitting there by itself. I don't know. You're the expert in that regard.
Right. No, that makes sense. It's kind of tricky because Elves does mulligan really well, right? Because of those Winding Ways and those Lead the Stampedes. So it is valuable to have those in those hands. But I would say that, yes, but those cards are not very good unless you have the mana to work with them. So yes, I would definitely keep a Winding Way, Lead the Stampede hand, but you would at least need to have a Mana Dork or a Priest of Titania in order to go forward with it. And the challenge too is in certain matchups, like mono red, like a bad matchup. I don't know if I would even prioritize that. I would probably just work towards like the most combo-y hand I have and just hope that my opponent has nothing, because it's like I'm probably going to lose no matter what. And my best bet is that my opponent just like draws 6 lands in a row and doesn't have the removal spell. And my only hope is just to combo out on like turn 2 and just win.
That makes sense.
Like knowing that route can be really important.
That makes a lot of sense. That's high rolling a different way, right? Whereas instead of like, oh, I'm just going to try to draw 4 off of this, like I know my opponent's playing mono red madness, and they have 16 removal spells in their deck, but I'm just going to hope they don't draw any of them. And most of the time that's not going to work out. But if you're already low enough that like you really need a miracle to happen, maybe it does work out, and then you can win that game from there. So if you mulligan low, you really need to try to take advantage of luck, basically. Like you need to rely a little bit more on luck because you've already gotten unlucky. And if everything then just plays like 50% luck and 50% like, everything's really standard, you're going to lose just because you have fewer resources. And so you really need to play into that when you mulligan low.
All right. So I sent over a document to you on Discord, Marsh, and you can review it there. But if you go down to page 2, this is the first kind of mulligan question that I have for you. So this example hand is in a mono black sack deck, and you have 4 swamps, a village rites, not dead after all, which is just a recursion spell. You could replace that with supernatural stamina and it would be the same. And then rite of consumption. Is this a hand you would ever keep?
No, there is no world where I would keep this hand. It's so far from what you need it to do. First of all, I consider anything over 3 lands a mulligan anyway. If you have 4 lands, the 4th land is so irrelevant almost every single time that it's basically a 6-card hand anyway. My sweet spot is 2 lands anyway, so a 3rd land is like, I almost think of like half a card, because like you can do so much off of 2 lands that I don't even love a 3rd land, but you can keep a 3-lander depending on the other cards. The only time I would ever keep 4 lands is if I had Supernatural Stamina, Nested Shambler, and then either Carrion Feeder or Vampire.
Yeah.
That is a hand that can almost get there just on those 3 cards. It's still really risky, because if you just lose your grower, you're going to lose the game. But I could definitely see keeping that hand. But otherwise, like, I'm not keeping a 4 swamp hand almost ever. But then on top of that, you have no creatures. I would never keep a hand that has 0 creatures either, because look at every single spell that you put in the hand. Sacrifice a creature, target creature.
Yeah, this is a level 1 mulligan, right? Like there's no doubt about it. There's nothing playable in your hand. You have to draw, or else you do nothing the whole game. Just black and white, easy enough.
Well, mono black, but yeah, I get you.
This next hand is also a little trickier. All right, so this one is 1 swamp, so it's a 1-land hand. A supernatural stamina, a carrion feeder, an unearth, 2 mortician beetles, and a cursed marauder. So this hand contains some of the most powerful cards in your deck and is on 1 land, but is missing a part of your deck, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're familiar with my play of Black Sack at all, you know that I'm not opposed to keeping a 1-lander. In fact, I keep quite a few of them. So it is something to consider. I'm not saying like, oh, it's a 1-lander, no problem. Like, it's definitely something to keep in mind, but it doesn't automatically mean that it's something to throw back in Black Sack specifically. A 1-lander in any mid-range deck, any control deck, most combo decks, unless they're playing 4 lands or whatever, is probably going to be a handy mulligan. But with an aggro deck, specifically Black Sack, where the 1-drops are so powerful, you can keep a 1-lander sometimes. This hand is missing a very important piece, which is fodder. We don't have anything that we want to sacrifice, which is especially key because that means our unearth and our supernatural stamina don't give us as much value as we would like. They can be used to save or recur your beetle or your feeder if they die, which is really key, because if you play, with this hand, I'm probably leading on a carrion feeder and just hoping it doesn't die. And then if it does, I'll unearth it. But carrion feeder coming back from an unearth doesn't give you any value. Whereas if you lose a Nezumi Link Breaker and then bring it back, you're up a mercenary, right? So you get a lot more value that way. So I think this hand is keepable in the right matchup. I wouldn't keep it against anything, but I think I could see it being good enough. For example, against a control or combo deck, I think I'd be more likely to keep it because it's got your most powerful, most speedy creatures in Carrion Feeder and Beetles, and it's got some resilience. So even if you're against a cast down deck and they cast down your Carrion Feeder, you can get it back with an Unearth. If you have drawn a 2nd land and can hold up a stamina to keep it around, you can do that too. And then the payoff is there. If we just start top decking, even if we don't get a 2nd land, if we just start getting our double body creatures, then we can play a carrion feeder and then a beetle and then suddenly have them be 3/3s. And then we can unearth that creature and have them be 5/5s. And we can stamina it. We can have them be 7/7s. Yeah. So the payoff is there. And against a deck that is, you really need to be fast, I think this hand might do it.
Yeah. Do you think you would keep it against like a Rally Red?
God, no. This hand is terrible against Rad Rally. it's funny because Beetle is probably one of your best cards against Red Rally because
Uh-huh.
it can block. First of all, Carrion Feeder can't block,
Mhm.
but it gets big enough. If you make it a 4/4, it can block anything and it survives a bolt. But how do you ever get there? That's a deck that plays a fair number of removal spells. They're going to have their Lightning Bolt, Scalp Blasts, maybe even some Chain Lightnings or Fire Blasts. And even if you're on the play, you start with a Beetle, and then they play a Goblin Tomb Raider, which is already bigger than your guy, or maybe even a Clockwork Percussionist. Doesn't matter. But then, like, next turn, if you don't draw a land, you play a Carrion Feeder. You could make your Beetle a 2/2 if you want to sack the feeder to itself. That's not good. And suddenly they're playing Burning Tree into Rally. Okay, so you've already taken like 5 or 6 damage. Then the next turn, if we've drawn a fodder creature by now, we can make our guys 3/3s, but now they still die to bolts. If we draw a second land, we can get a Beetle and then like sack our feeder to itself and unearth it. But we need, the big thing here is we need 2 things for the deck, the hint to function, and that's a second swamp and at least 1 fodder creature. And we can't bank on getting those. It's literally impossible to get those by turn 2 if we're on the play. But even if we draw them like runner, we get those. Red Rally's just too fast. We're going to be behind already.
Right. What about in the mirror match? Would you keep this one?
That's a really interesting question. I think you would 100%. Beetle is incredible in the mirror match because it counts both players sacrificing a creature. And a Cursed Marauder is really good with Beetles, of course, if we can get to that second mana. And then if we can unearth the Marauder or stamina the Marauder, it can be effective at making our opponents sacrifice their growers if we're able to get through their fodder. And then our Beetles just go crazy. So you could definitely get steamrolled if you don't get the right draws, but I think the Beetles are strong enough in the mirror match I would keep it.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I would almost even consider this one as keepable against like an Elves matchup. With the potential of drawing that other land if it's already, especially if it was like game 1 and you knew that you were going to be playing against Elves, that Cursed Marauder with these recursions, if you draw that next land, you have the potential to just turn the game around and just destroy your opponent.
Yeah. It sounds a little bit like elvish propaganda from you to try to get people to keep bad hands against elves.
Keep it, please.
Because if you don't draw that second swamp, you're going to lose the game 100%. I don't see a world where you win without the swamp. But if you get it, you're right. The hand gets really good because then you start with a Beetle, then you play another Beetle. Say you draw your swamp, then you Curse Marauder. They've got probably 3 or 4 creatures out already, so you're not hitting the best thing, but your Beetles both get 2 counters. You start attacking for 6. Then the next turn you can unearth and then stamina your Marauder, make them sack 2 guys. Your Beetles are suddenly 7/7s. It gets pretty good at that point. But
give them that last land.
Yeah, but if you don't get that land, or maybe you top deck Snuff Out, and that would also bridge the gap. But if you don't get the land, you probably just lose the game. So I don't love it there, but like I could see keeping it in the right situation.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, this is kind of one of those things on the line. This is one other piece of advice that I've seen opponents run into. Remember that if you are on the draw, always wait for your opponent's mulligan decision before making your mulligan decision, because you have that luxury of knowing whether your opponent's going down to 6 cards before you decide whether or not to keep your cards. Now, it's kind of like a small benefit, because again, the most important thing is that your deck's doing what it needs to do, but there's times that knowing that can really sway you in one way or another and can determine whether or not you keep a hand or are able to utilize that hand to win the match.
Yeah, if they mulligan down to 6 and then you get to choose which one you want to do because you're kind of on the fence, I think there might be times where I would keep a 7-card hand if my opponent mulligans, and I wouldn't if they kept it. But especially, I think the most telling thing is if they draw 7 cards and just it's instantly a keep. They're like, "Yep, I'm good," and you're on the fence. That's not going to be a good situation. Like if you're on the fence, you're like, well, I need to draw this card, or I need to do this, or if they have this, they have a great hand if they keep it in like 3 seconds. So you need a good hand to mirror that. So yeah, definitely, it's important to wait for them to make the decision there.
Okay, and then I have one more for you. If we go down to the Wildfire one, Wildfire is a deck that I'm not familiar with playing. I know you are familiar with playing. This is Gen Wildfire. On surface level, this hand is 2 lands. They produce all of your colors of mana. We have also a Nile Spellbomb, a Writhing Chrysalis, a Blood Fountain, a Cast Down, and a Cleansing Wildfire. Is this hand a snap keep in the blind?
I wouldn't say snap keep, but I think I would keep it. I think the very big important thing here is that you have 2 tap lands. If you had 1 untapped land, I would say it's a snap keep, because I think almost any hand that can Cleansing Wildfire your own bridge on turn 2 is a snap keep, because that's what the deck wants to do. It's very powerful, and it's just the greatest way to start the game. But the second tap land makes it a little bit more challenging. You do have things to play on turn 2, even with the second tap land. You can play a Spell Bomb if you're against an opponent where the graveyard might matter, Spy or Terror or something. And you have just a Blood Fountain to sit on the field until later, if not. And then if you don't draw a land, you can still Cleansing Wildfire turn 3, and that's not a bad way to start. But it is a little bit slow. I think if we're in the blind, I'm going to keep it, because on average, you're going to go up against a deck that doesn't punish you for being this slow, I would say, because there's a lot of mid-range and control decks out there.
Yeah.
But if you go up against a more aggro deck or something, this is the exact hand that I want my opponent to keep if I'm on Black Sack or Red Rally or anything like that, right? It's a bunch of cards that don't do anything except kind of progress their game plan, and it's a lot of tap lands.
Yeah, it's definitely as Admiral Akbar would say,
it's a trap.
It can definitely be a bit of a trap.
Really great in like a control type matchup. If you were in the mirror, this is the hand that you would want to keep probably every time, because you got the Cleansing Wildfire, you have the card advantage. It also depends on whether you're on the play versus the draw, maybe a little bit, especially against an aggro deck. If you're on the draw, this feels even worse, because they're going to be 1 turn ahead of you already, and then you're basically 2 turns behind with the bridges. And if you're running if it's a aggro deck that usually doesn't care about the graveyard too much, then Nile Spellbomb is just kind of a blank card, and you have really good cards in those matchups, right? Like you could mulligan into a Kark clan and you could potentially wipe out their board. And so why keep a mediocre hand when you could have an amazing 6-card hand in that matchup, right?
Yeah. And I think an important thing to keep in mind is this is like a whole other topic, is like try not to be results oriented, and not to have results oriented thinking, which is just because you make a decision and then the result is that you're in a worse position doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. So if you mulligan a 7-card hand that's kind of on the fence, and then you get a no-lander for 6 cards, and then a no-lander for 5 cards, and suddenly you're down to 4 cards, that sucks, and it feels like, well, I should have kept that 7-card hand. If you knew that was going to be the sequence of draws next, sure.
Right.
But there's no universe where you can know that, and if the 7-card hand is bad, you got to mulligan it.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter that you could draw a worse hand. You should just stick true to the fact that, like, I know this hand is not good enough. I need to mulligan it. Hopefully you don't draw those terrible hands next, but it doesn't mean you made a wrong decision. It just means that you got unlucky this time.
Right. Yeah, it's like in poker. Like you have a 4 of a kind. If you're and you go all in, it's right to go in all in every time. And then the one time your opponent has a royal flush and beats you out, that's like it doesn't mean what you did was wrong.
Yeah.
You lost because you got unlucky in that situation, and you lost the 1%er.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining. This is the Familiar Podcast. Feel free to let comments know. Let us know what we might have said wrong. But otherwise, have a great day.
Thanks for watching.